What is an anti-pope? There's an official definition. It's a person who claims or exercises the office of the Bishop of Rome without being canonically elected or legitimately succeeding to it. And luckily for us, the Vatican maintains a pretty convenient list. Currently it has 37 names on it, stretching from Hippolytus in 217 to Felix V, who resigned in 1449 and was given a cardinal's hat for his trouble, so can't say anyone leaves empty-handed. The list, however, has always been disputed. It continues to be disputed, and the Vatican's own official yearbook, the Annuario Pontificio, has hedged on several entries since the 1960s, appending question marks to names that were once presented as settled facts. Now, the anti-popes are not a footnote to church history. They're rather a quite reliable index of what was at stake when power, doctrine, and institutional legitimacy were all simultaneously contested. But what really makes this interesting is the mechanism. The anti-popes were not produced by the same cause across 12 centuries. They were produced by different institutional failures at different times, and tracking those changes is going to tell you more about the development of the medieval church than, well, almost any other single thread will. The early anti-popes emerged from this doctrinal schisms when election procedure was undefined and the boundary between legitimate disagreement and schism was pretty blurry. And the dark century anti-popes emerged from the Roman aristocratic families, treating the papacy as some kind of heritable property. The Reformation-era anti-popes emerged from emperors needing institutional leverage in the investiture controversy. The Western Schism produced anti-popes from within the College of Cardinals itself, which is the most structurally significant category of all. Every act of this account changes the mechanism, while the product always stays pretty much the same. And that product is a man sitting in Rome, or Avignon, or a castle above the sea, claiming to be the vicar of Christ, when the church says he is not. So today we're going to talk about all of the anti-popes in this rather long video. Seems to be a little bit of a gap in the videos that we've done so far. We've talked about evil popes, sure, in that series, but we haven't talked about anti-popes. So here we are. Anyway, before we get into it, as we are crowd-funded, I give the thanks to those who are supporting. The links are in the pinned comment and description, keeping us ad-free and sponsor-free, all the rest. And if you can't do that, that's okay. Just give us a like, comment, and subscribe, and that'll get us through. Anyway, let's begin. Now, of course, we said we'd begin with Hippolytus, or Hippolytus, from 217 to 235, quite an early anti-pope, and here we are. Now, Hippolytus of Rome is the first anti-pope, and the only one on this list who is also a canonized saint. And that tells you most of what you need to know about the era's particular quality. He was the most learned man in the Roman community of the day, a prolific theologian who wrote biblical commentaries, hagiographies, which is like a diary of the saints, a chronicle of world history, and the apostolic tradition, which is the earliest detailed description of Christian liturgy, and has shaped debates about early church practice ever since. Of course, the early church and the history of that is a completely different topic, and we'll get to it eventually. So you have that to look forward to. Now, he wrote in Greek, which at the time was still the language of the Roman Church in the early 3rd century. He was by any measure a major intellectual figure, but also a man of fierce and uncompromising conviction, which is what made him, in a technical sense, an anti-pope. The dispute that produced the schism was doctrinal and disciplinary. Pope Zephyrinus was, in Hippolytus's view, intellectually inadequate and guided too heavily by his deacon Callixtus, a man who had been a slave, by the way, been convicted of fraud, briefly been a mining convict in Sardinia, and risen through the church hierarchy by what Hippolytus regarded as a shameless self-promotion. Gotta climb that ladder, Well, when Zephyrinus died in 217 and Callixtus was elected his successor, Hippolytus had well and truly ran out of patience. He had two objections. The first was in a doctrinal sense. Callixtus I was, in Hippolytus's judgment, a monarchianism, a sympathizer, someone who inadequately maintained the distinction of persons within the Trinity, collapsing the Father and Son too readily into a single identity. The early church had a lot of different doctrinal disputes about this. Now, the second was on moral grounds. Callixtus had ruled that adulterers and murderers could be readmitted to full communion after penance, and that a noblewoman could be regarded as validly married to a slave, even though Roman law did not recognize such a union. To Hippolytus, the church that forgave these sins was no longer the pure body it was meant to be. Adultery and murder a little bit beyond the pale for old Hippolytus. So he gathered a community of followers in Rome, styled himself their bishop, and maintained a rival structure alongside the legitimate church for the rest of his life. The institutional picture of two communities in one city, each claiming to be the true Roman Church, each with its own bishop, each conducting its own sacraments. That is the template for everything that follows in this account. Now, as for Callixtus, he died in 222, succeeded by Urban I and then Pontian. Hippolytus continued as rival bishop throughout all of these following popes. The theologian production of his faction was considerable. The refutation of all heresies survives. A monumental survey of philosophical and heretical thought. That is also a sustained polemic against the mainstream church that Hippolytus had left. What a rebel, don't you think? Well, the ending is the strangest and perhaps most theologically resonant moment of the entire story. In 235, the Emperor Maximinus Thrax, that is, began the persecution of Christians, specifically targeting the leadership. Both Pope Pontian and anti-Pope Hippolytus were arrested and deported to the Sardinian mines, which is basically a death sentence in the 3rd century, just with a bit of extra hard labor tacked onto it. Now, in those mines, in the same forced labor, the same darkness, the same shared suffering, they reconciled. I suppose you would, wouldn't you? Hippolytus urged his followers in Rome to rejoin the legitimate church. Pontian abdicated to allow a new election, his see, rather, to allow a new election, and both men died in the mines, probably around 235. Their bodies were brought back to Rome and honored together. The church celebrates both as martyrs, both of them as saints. Hippolytus' feast day was the 13th of August until 2021, when Pope Francis moved him to the 30th of January alongside Pontian's feast, pairing them as they were in death. I think they might have preferred it that way, maybe. Now, what's really interesting about Hippolytus is he is the only saint among all 40 anti-popes. And the entire video's irony is loaded in this first entry, if we're going to call it irony, which I suppose I could. No, the next act that follows it Novatian, Felix II, Ursinus, Eulalius, Laurentius, Dioscorus, traces the progressive accumulation of crises that would eventually force the Church to define what a legitimate papal election actually was. And each entry adds a different kind of mode of failure. Well, by 530, when Dioscorus died after 22 days in office, and the Church quietly listed his rival as the legitimate pope, the institution had survived 6 distinct varieties of contested succession, without ever having written down the rules that would prevent the next one. But the rules would come, just slowly, usually in direct response to crises most recently survived and battled through, and they would never be quite complete enough to prevent the next generation of crises from finding the remaining gaps. Now, we could end Hippolytus' story there, but there's a few intellectual achievements that are worth talking about. Now, he wrote the Refutation of All Heresies, a comprehensive catalogue of every philosophical school and heretical movement that he could identify, preserved in its near-complete form only in the 19th century when the manuscript was found in a monastery at Mount Athos. Look it up, Mount Athos. It's really nice. If you're allowed to go there, that is. Well, he also wrote commentaries on Daniel and the Song of Songs that are among the oldest surviving Christian biblical commentaries. He wrote the Apostolic Tradition, if the attribution, which is debated, is correct, which describes the rites of baptism, ordination, and the Eucharist, with a specificity that has made it the foundational document for modern liturgical reconstruction. But he also calculated the date of Easter and produced a 16-year cycle for its determination. So he was, in other words, a man whose theological production was genuinely important to the development of Western Christianity, a man who spent years as the leader of a schismatic community, and is now canonized as a result of dying, being worked and whipped to death in a mine, alongside a pope he used to oppose but became friends due to the suffering. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. We have Novatian from 251 to 258. The Decian persecution of 249 to 251 produced the first large-scale crisis of Christian identity in the Roman Church, because the persecution asked a specific question: will you sacrifice to the Roman gods, or will you not? Now, the Christians who sacrificed, the lapsi, i.e. the fallen, they were a substantial population. Many had done so only technically, of course. They purchased certificates of sacrifice without actually doing it. A bit of paperwork to get yourself out of the bureaucracy. So when Decius died, and the persecution ended, the Church faced a problem of theology. What is to be done to the lapsi, the fallen? Can they be readmitted? And if so, how to do it, on what terms? The answer was given by Pope Cornelius, elected in 251, and that was yes. After a period of penance appropriate to the severity of the lapse, the fallen could be restored to full communion. A get-out-of-jail-free card from the new pope. Good for them. Now, Novatian, a Roman priest who had been leading the candidacy for the papacy before Cornelius' election, well, he disagreed, and quite fundamentally so. Novatian was not a morally disreputable man in the way that many later antipopes would be, as, I don't want to give anything away, but you'll see. He was the author of the first known theological treatise written in Latin, because do remember, it used to be Greek. That was De Trinitate, in defense of Orthodox Trinitarian theology. It would be read as an authoritative account for 2 centuries. He was learned, personally austere, and genuinely convinced that the Church had no power to forgive apostasy, murder, or adultery. These were sins beyond the reach of ecclesiastical absolution. You do it once and, well, you're not getting into heaven. Too bad, so sad. He was consecrated as bishop by 3 Italian bishops he had summoned to Rome under false pretenses, establishing a rival church that called itself the Cathari, or the Pure Ones. And yes, indeed, that is where we have the later medieval Bogomil movement, which we'll talk about later. The Cathars, they did get the idea and naming convention from that, also meaning pure ones. Now, the movement spread with remarkable speed. Novatianist communities appeared across the empire, from Gaul to North Africa to the east. Both Cornelius and Novatian were caught in the Valerian persecution, and they died between 253 and 58. The Novatianist movement outlasted them by roughly 2 centuries, eventually absorbed into the Donatist and other rigorous traditions. Novatian had lost the argument about forgiveness. He had won the argument about longevity. The theology of Novatian's De Trinitate was somewhat ironically entirely orthodox on the question of the Trinity, i.e., he defended the full divinity of the Son with the clarity that would have satisfied the later Council of Nicaea. He was the rigorous schismatic par excellence, condemned not for heresy but for excessive strictness about penance. And that's where the question of what to do with Christians who had lapsed under persecution would come in. It was a question about the nature of the Church itself. Novatian's position that the Church was a community of the confirmed saved, not some kind of rehab for sinners, had a coherent theological logic. If the Church's sacraments derived their power from the holiness of the community that administered them, well, then a community rather contaminated by apostasy was a community whose sacraments were compromised. Cornelius's counterposition that the Church's sacramental power derives from Christ's institution rather than the community's moral status would eventually become Catholic dogma, resolved most clearly by Augustine in his anti-Donatist writings. But the resolution was not obvious in 251. Of course, everything's a bit clearer in hindsight, and the fact that Novatian had the purer theology on the Trinity while holding the harder line on forgiveness is perhaps one of the period's most characteristic ironies. You see, the rigorist was orthodox, and the lenient were also orthodox, and the 2 positions were simultaneously irreconcilable, but both sincerely Christian positions. Well, next up we've got Felix II, 355 to 365. The Emperor Constantinius II was Arian, a Christian who held that the Son of God was a created being subordinate to the Father, a position that the Council of Nicaea had condemned in 325, but hey, old habits die hard, and it continued to have its, frankly, powerful imperial patrons along with the general population. Now, when Pope Liberius refused to condemn Athanasius, the Alexandrian bishop who was Arianism's most formidable opponent, Constantius exiled him. He needed a pope who would toe the line, and he installed one, Felix II, a Roman archdeacon consecrated in 355, with the support of a council of cooperative bishops while Liberius was in Thrace. Felix II served as the Arian emperor's pope for 2 years, and then Liberius, in exile and apparently broken by the experience, can't really blame him, signed up for a compromise formula that was, well, at least ambiguous on the Nicene question. In any case, he was allowed to return because of this. Felix was expelled from Rome by a populace that preferred Liberius, lived on in reduced circumstances, though, and he died in 365, so At least they didn't rope him. Now, what happened afterwards is the more remarkable story. The Roman Church venerated a martyr saint named Felix, whose feast day on the 29th of July, and whose story involved dying for the faith during the Arian crisis. And this martyr, Felix, was, it eventually emerged, almost certainly a different person, possibly a fictional composite, possibly a real Felix, but not the anti-pope that we're talking about. But for centuries, the two had been confused in the hagiographic tradition, and the anti-pope Felix II was listed in martyrologies, venerated as a saint who suffered for orthodoxy. Awkward, right? Well, scholarly investigation in the post-Tridentine period progressively identified the confusion, and in the 20th century, the Bollandists and the Roman martyrology revisionists finally disentangled the two figures. The Annuario Pontificio lists Felix II as an anti-pope, plain and simple. The miracle is not that the Church venerated an anti-pope as a saint by accident, but that it took so damn long to notice the mistake. And it's a pretty big mistake. Anyway, the theological context of the Felix II incident is the Arian crisis at its height, which is a completely different topic that needs its own video, but for now we can just say that Constantius II believed he was doing God's will by bringing the fractured Christian bishops into agreement with what he understood as correct theology. And he had the full force of imperial patronage to bring to bear the recalcitrant clergy. Liberius was not the only bishop to capitulate under this pressure. Osius of Cordova, the old counselor of Constantine who had presided at Nicaea, eventually signed a compromise formula. The spectacle of the papacy divided between an exile who had capitulated and a replacement who was cooperating with an emperor pressing a heretical policy shows a structural problem that would occur not just this time but many times after, i.e. the papacy's claim to stand above political pressure was substantial only when it had political support. So without a power comparable to the emperor's, the Bishop of Rome was as vulnerable to imperial theology as anybody else. Anyway, let's move on to Ursinus, 366 to 367. Pope Liberius died on the 24th of September 366, and before his body was buried, two separate Roman communities had elected two separate successors. Damasus was chosen by one faction, and Ursinus by another. And Ursinus was consecrated in the Julian Basilica by the Bishop of Tibur. What followed was, well, not an ecclesiastical dispute, but it was more of a, I suppose you'd call it a street riot. I mean, that's the best terms we can get for it, really. Damasus hired, or at least deployed, a workforce of strong men and thugs, hired goons, basically. The ancient sources even mention gladiators and charioteers, men used to doing a bit of rough work for a living, and they attacked Ursinus's followers through a sustained campaign that lasted into the following year. The climactic event was a massacre inside the Basilica of Sicininus. There we go, I got it. The Basilica of Sicininus. 137 bodies were subsequently counted inside the building. Now, it's bad enough to have a massacre, but inside the actual basilica, now, God ought to not be too impressed with that one. But what about this number, 137? Well, that comes from Ammianus Marcellinus, a pagan military historian who found the whole business quite disgusting and said so in quite full-on terms. He was not impressed with everyone's behavior. I suppose you wouldn't be. He noted that the bishops of Rome lived in a style that would satisfy any provincial grandee, and that men were killing each other for the privilege of the office. Now, Damasus prevailed, and is now recognized as one of the most important popes in history. He commissioned Jerome to produce the Latin Vulgate translations of the Bible, established the papacy's claims to primacy over the other sees on scriptural grounds, and built and restored basilicas throughout Rome. He also had himself buried in a church that he built for the purpose, with a self-composed epitaph praising his own virtue. Now, as for Ursinus, he was exiled from Rome repeatedly. He kept coming back, stirring up trouble and getting kicked out again. And eventually he disappears from the record sometime around the 380s, still claiming that he had been the legitimately elected Bishop of Rome. The first papal election, decided by body count, produced one of the most consequential papacies in Christian history. This is the kind of moral accounting that makes the anti-pope list so instructive. Now, as for Damasus I, he is in retrospect a pretty pivotal figure. He articulated the claim that the Roman see's authority derived specifically from the commission to Peter, not from Rome's imperial status, which was frankly already declining, but he also commissioned the philologist Jerome to do all the writing of the scriptures, the Vulgate, and that was authoritative as the Western Bible for over 1,000 years. So that's pretty good, right? But he also restored and decorated the tombs of the Roman martyrs with pretty elegantly composed verse inscriptions, many of which survive, by the way. The irony of the papacy is that, well, one of the most intellectually and institutionally significant of the early church, as it was still born of the massacre of 137 people. That is the specific irony of the period. You'll get to the good stuff once you walk knee-deep through the blood, I suppose. Institutional greatness comes at a cost. Next up we have Eulalius, 418 to 419, another short-reign anti-pope. So when Pope Zosimus died on 26th of December 418, two rival consecrations took place almost simultaneously. The Archdeacon Eulalius was installed in the Lateran Basilica, and Boniface was consecrated in a Cadalus church across the city. Now, Emperor Honorius, sitting in Ravenna, initially ruled for Eulalius, but then he reversed himself when the Roman Senate and a significant portion of the clergy appealed on Boniface's behalf. I love that name, Boniface. Anyway, the situation became absurd when both men arrived in Rome to celebrate Easter, and neither would really defer to the other. Quite absurd and awkward indeed. So Honorius had to expel both of them from the city, while a synod considered the matter, and then ruled definitively in favor of Boniface. Eulalius accepted the judgment, and was subsequently appointed Bishop of Naples, living out his days of relative comfort as a provincial bishop, a nice little retirement. Now, the resolution, a peaceful transfer of claims, a comfortable retirement in a nice little diocese, would be among the most civilized of any in this account, and it is the exception, not the rule. Now, the Eulalius episode is notable for what it reveals about the role of the Western emperor in papal elections. Honorius in Ravenna had no canonical authority to decide between the two claimants. The election was a matter for the church, not the state. But his decision was, in practice, what tipped the scale, because he controlled the military, you see, and the administrative apparatus that would enforce whichever outcome he chose. So there's the rules on paper, and then there's the reality. And in came the reality to, not to the favor of Eulalius, I'm afraid. But he seemed to be cool with it, so whatever. The emperor's de facto electoral arbiter was a role that a lot of other emperors would play sporadically throughout the 5th century. The Eastern emperors were more consistently through the 7th doing this, but we'll get to them later. Now, the 1059 decree giving cardinals primary authority was, in part, an attempt to remove this de facto imperial role. But once again, paper and reality. But in 418, the emperor's judgment was simply accepted as the practical resolution of an impossible situation, and the church was grateful for an answer that it could finally implement an end to all the arguing, which seems to never really benefit anybody. But the main thing was Eulalius' acceptance of the verdict and his subsequent comfortable career as a provincial bishop. That set a precedent that would be followed rarely, but remembered fondly. So good job to Eulalius there. Setting a good example, I guess. Well, next up we've got Laurentius, 498 to 506. Bit of a longer reign this time. The Laurentian Schism was Rome's longest and most socially destructive internal papal dispute before the Western Schism. Before you jump in and say, be really about the Western Schism. We'll get to that later, all right? Be patient with me. It's a long video. Don't worry, I got my coffee here. Got it all. See? Yes, there we go. Now, when Pope Anastasius II died in 498, the Roman clergy and Senate split between two candidates. You had Symmachus, supported by the Reform faction and most of the clergy, and Laurentius, supported by the Roman senatorial aristocracy, and those who favored accommodation with Constantinople. Now, both men were consecrated on the same day in different basilicas. Once again, awkward timing. The Ostrogothic king, Theodoric, who governed Italy as a Roman administrator without really being Roman himself, initially declared for Symmachus, and then wavered as the political situation grew a little bit more complicated. A sequence of synods, documents, and factional accusations turned Rome into a city divided by street gangs rather than a theological argument. The specific issues were several. How to relate to the Eastern Roman Church after the Acacian Schism that had divided East and West since 484, whether Symmachus had committed simony in securing his election, that's basically buying yourself into the job, and the secondary question of Easter dating, which had already been established, but, things change over time. The primary energy of the schism was factional rather than doctrinal. The senatorial aristocracy saw the papacy as a political prize, and Laurentius was their candidate, as much as he was anyone's theological preference. Violence in the streets of Rome continued intermittently for years. A synod in 502 exonerated Symmachus, though the verdict was contested. Now, Laurentius eventually withdrew to an estate of a patron, where he died sometime around 506 or 507. The Laurentian Schism was also historically productive. The controversy generated some of the earliest Christian writings about the limits of synodal authority to judge a pope, a question that would remain contentious for the next 1,000 years, and still is. Now, the Laurentian Schism is also the first papal dispute in which the surviving documentation allows us to read both sides' arguments in something pretty close to their own terms. The Symmachian documents, a collection of forged papal decrees and council acts produced to support the Symmachian claim, are among the most consequential forgeries in papal history, establishing precedents for papal immunity from synodal judgment that would be deployed in canonical arguments for centuries. Whether Symmachus' supporters knew they were producing forgeries or believed they were elaborating genuine principles in fictitious historical form, that is something we don't know, and we're probably never going to know. Sorry to disappoint you. But that's not the point. The point is that the Laurentian Schism did not merely divide Rome's street factions, it more produced the textual ammunition for a theory of papal authority that far outlasted the immediate controversy. Laurentius lost in Rome. The documents generated in the process of defeating him were used to argue for papal supremacy for the next 500 years. Maybe not the legacy he wanted, but it's the legacy that he got. I suppose no authority existed with the power to simply declare one man the legitimate pope and enforce that declaration against others' supporters, but what did exist was the slow attrition of factional resources, the progressive withdrawal of key backers, and the eventual isolation of the weaker claimant. And that's why the Laurentian schism's duration is a reminder that the resolution of a disputed papal election in this period was one of political exhaustion rather than anything else. Still, Laurentius got a good little retirement. Not too bad. He got pretty lucky. The pattern, withdrawal rather than formal submission, that will recur throughout the list. That's one of the reasons why the Church's official designation of who was the legitimate pope in a contested case is always a retrospective judgment rather than a contemporaneous one. And after all, no one really wants that responsibility. I'm afraid sorry doesn't cut it with this pope. Anyway, moving on. Well, let's jump forward about 24 years to 530 with Dioscorus. Now, Felix IV died on 22nd of December 530, having designated his own successor, an unusual and contested act, and 2 elections followed. The majority of the clergy chose Dioscorus, while a minority supported the man that Felix had nominated, who took the name Boniface II. Once again, love the name Boniface. If there's anyone named Boniface listening, make sure you leave a comment. Anyway, Dioscorus died 22 days after his election, before the situation could be resolved by any other means. As for Boniface II, remember, he survived. He reigned for several years and is counted as the legitimate pope. Dioscorus is listed as the anti-pope. Now here's the stark lesson. In 530, as at various other points in this account, the designation of anti-pope was partly determined by longevity. Dioscorus had, by some canonical arguments, the stronger claim. He had the majority clergy support. It's just the problem was he died first, which generally makes you unable to do the job. And the winners write the list, which is why the outline's observation about this entry is accurate. So Dioscorus is a tidy demonstration of the fact that posterity and legitimacy are not always the same thing. But it's also a reminder that the Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes, the primary source for the early papal history, was compiled by people who had an institutional interest in presenting a clean succession. The Liber Pontificalis was a living document, added to over centuries by scribes who worked for the winners of each dispute. You see where the problem is, right? When Boniface II survived and Dioscorus did not, well, in came Boniface's supporters to write the account that subsequent history has mostly accepted, till we get to the modern era and a little bit more gutsy hindsight. You're allowed to engage in hindsight these days without being brought before inquisitions and all the rest. Now, the alternate account, in which Dioscorus was the legitimate candidate who died before he could consolidate his claim, exists in the sources only as a residual ambiguity. The tradition of the list is also the tradition of the scribes, and the scribes served the popes who, well, 1, survived, and 2, paid the bills. So, Dioscorus is also a reminder of a specific feature of the 5th century church governance. The election procedures were sufficiently informal that a question like, who won could remain genuinely open for the duration of a man's tenure. In a later era, the conclave would produce a definitive result within days, and anyone installed outside that process could be clearly identified as an interloper. But in 530 there was no conclave. There was a community divided, 2 ordinations performed, and then the biological accident of one man dying before the other. It all looks different in retrospect. That designation of Dioscorus as an antipope is a judgment about survival, not the legitimacy of an election in any sense. Anyway, let's move on. And before we do, just a little bit of an introduction about our second act. Oh, and there's also a few little caveats. We have to talk about the Dark Ages, I suppose. Well, we're a little bit later on the Dark Ages. This period is going to start from 687, but you know what I mean. Early medieval. The papacy between the late 7th and late 10th centuries reached its institutional nadir, a period that the Catholic historians have called the pornocracy. And yes, you heard that right, meaning roughly rule by prostitutes, referring to the denomination of the Roman Church by particular aristocratic clans and the women they kept around. Now, if you watch the Evil Popes series, you'll know what I'm talking about, and, well, the anti-popes are going to get quite interesting here. So the more accurate description is that the office of the Bishop of Rome became a prize fought over by a great Roman family, the Theophylacts and the Crescenzi, the Tusculani as well, with outcomes determined by military force, and occasionally a little sprinkling of murder. Because why not? Gotta climb that ladder again, don't you? Now, the emperors in Constantinople and the later Frankish and German emperors in the north sometimes would intervene when things got really hairy. Sometimes they would stabilize the situation, and sometimes they would make it a whole lot worse. This is the period that would eventually produce the reform movement of the 11th century, which would itself then produce anti-popes through a different mechanism. Before the cure, however, comes the disease in its most virulent form. Now, one figure worth noting before the entries even begin, since a lot of historians don't count him as an anti-pope at all, and he's not really on the list, is Christopher, who held the papacy from July 903 to January 904, having deposed the legitimate Leo V. Christopher was subsequently deposed and murdered by Sergius III. Some catalogues list him as a legitimate pope. The Annario Pontificio lists him as an anti-pope, but some historians classify him as neither and list him in the brackets, so, there's a bit of argumentation. He is the most honestly ambiguous entry in the entire sequence, and a fair representative of what the Dark Century looked like. Men seizing office, getting deposed, getting violently murdered, and leaving the question of their legitimacy to be sorted out by whoever's writing the history books after. Anyway, let's get into the first entry of this second act. First one is short and sweet. Theodore and Paschal, the year 687. Pope Conon died in September of that year, and the election that followed produced 3 claimants. Sergius I, elected by one faction in the Lateran, Theodore, elected by another, and Paschal, who had bribed the Byzantine exarch of Ravenna to support his candidacy. The exarch arrived from Ravenna to enforce his candidate's claim. The troops that accompanied him, saw which way the Roman populace was leaning and declared for Sergius instead. No refunds, I'm afraid. Now Theodore, who had been elected in the Lateran itself, deferred immediately and was treated with honor. Paschal, whose bid had involved both bribery and allegedly consulting with pagan fortune tellers about the election outcome, which is not what the Pope is meant to be doing, was condemned and imprisoned in a monastery. At least he had plenty of time to reflect. Now he died there, having never made public renunciation. Sergius went on to baptize the pagan Anglo-Saxon king Caedwalla in Rome, and to order Wilbrod, as the apostle to Frisia. Both significant moments in the Christianization of northern Europe, a slow and steady process, Lithuania being the last holdouts. Quite interesting. Now, the double anti-pope election was a chaotic prelude to a consequential papacy. Excuse me, I'm trying to stop myself from yawning. Right. You're probably already asleep anyway, but yeah. Now, the Theodore and Paschal episode also shows the specific role of the Byzantine exarch in the 7th century Roman Church politics. Ravenna was the seat of imperial authority in Italy, and the exarch, i.e. the emperor's representative, had formal approval rights over papal elections that the papacy was progressively trying to limit and that the exarch was progressively trying to exploit. You see where the problem is here, right? Paschal's bribery of the exarch was essentially an attempt to purchase the imperial endorsement that would make his election unchallengeable. But the plan failed when the troops that were supposed to enforce the endorsement saw the practical situation and chose to do things differently. A small demonstration of the Byzantine imperial church system encountering its own limitations at the western edge of its territory. Next we have Constantine II, 767 to 768, another short reign. The death of Pope Paul I in 768, created a power vacuum that a Lombard duke named Toto of Nepi was prepared to fill with his brother. The problem was that his brother, Constantine, was a layman, and the Church's increasingly settled convention required that popes be clerics already. So Toto solved this by having Constantine rushed through all 4 orders of the clergy, the old speed run. Oh, and by the way, that's acolyte, subdeacon, deacon, and priest, in a single day, and consecrated as bishop on the following day. Now that's a real speed run, and it's pretty damn obvious. Come on, he couldn't have learned that much. In any case, Constantine served for nearly a year, ordaining clergy, conducting services corresponding with the Frankish court. He did it all. His eventual deposition was accomplished through a combination of Lombard intervention and Frankish pressure. Stephen III was elected as the legitimate pope. Constantine was brought before a synod, stripped of his clerical orders, and subjected to the ritual degradation reserved for deposed clergy. His vestments were removed piece by piece, a symbolic dismantling of everything that Toto had assembled in a single day. He was also blinded, which was worse. Obviously, a Byzantine-influenced punishment that was partly practical, as a blinded man could not easily project the physical authority of leadership, and partly symbolic. He appears at one point in the synodal records, having been brought into proceedings, apparently suffering, making a confession and appeal, and then being led away. His subsequent fate in the monastery is obscure. He probably died there. But the canonical problem he created was not. And the problem was, what was to be done about the ordinations he had performed as pope? Because he was doing things. The clerics he ordained were real people, they had real ministries, and if his ordinations were invalid, well then so were the sacraments that those clerics had administered. A synod at Rome in 769 eventually ruled that laymen could not be elected to the papacy, a step toward the later requirement that popes be at a minimum deacon status, but left the validity of Constantine's ordinations diplomatically ambiguous. Now the Church preferred a practical problem it could manage over a doctrinal one that it could not resolve. Of course, practical problems are a bit easier. Now, of course, the people who had received all of these sacraments had done so in good faith. It wasn't their fault. The consequence of declaring their ordinations invalid would ripple through the entire community's ministerial structure. So, the council took the practical position, as councils generally did when faced with the alternative of sacramental chaos. It legislated forward rather than backward. What Constantine had done was declared impermissible for the future, but what he had done in the past was left in a kind of ambiguity that allows normal ecclesiastical life to continue. No harm, no foul. We'll clean it all up later. Well, let's get on to the next one. We have Philip. That's right, just Philip. 768. In the interval between Constantine II's deposition and the election of Stephen III, a monk named Philip was proclaimed pope by one of the Roman factions and occupied the Lateran for approximately 1 day. Not even joking, just 1 day. Apparently, he recognized almost immediately that he had no significant support, returned to his monastery voluntarily, and was never heard from again. I mean, that was a hell of a day, though, I suppose. The sources record his existence with the brevity appropriate to its substance. He is the most compact entry in the entire list, and the outline's instruction to play it completely straight is the correct approach. A man accepted the papacy in the morning, thought better of it by the evening, went home, and lived out his life as if nothing happened. Philip's anti-pontificate is a kind of photographic negative of the Western Schism, where men fought for the office for decades. And here's a guy who held it for 1 day and decided he'd rather just go back to being a monk. But what does Philip's case suggest? Well, it suggests that this is purely inferential, by the way, since the sources are a bit too brief to really talk about this. Well, I believe it suggests that the papacy in 768 was sufficiently dangerous to make voluntary withdrawal a rational choice. Constantine II was at that moment in the process of being deposed, degraded, and blinded. The city was full of factions with weapons. The Lombards were involved, which is not good news, and the Franks were about to become involved, which is even worse news. A monk who found himself accidentally acclaimed as pope on the same day that a better organized faction was assembling its own candidate might reasonably have concluded that returning to the monastery was the best course of action, and we can't really blame him for doing that. Philip is the only figure in the entire account who apparently looked at the papacy, thought about it, and said, "Nope, not for me." Of course, the list is full of men who were going to fight and die for the office. Philip thought that neither fighting nor dying for it was really worth it. Well, next let's move on to John, 844. Now, when Pope Gregory IV died in January of that year, a mob acclaimed a cleric named John as his successor in the Lateran, before the proper election could be organized. John was consecrated. The accounts are unclear on precisely how far the ceremony proceeded, and then withdrew within hours when the legitimate candidate, Sergius II, was elected by the clergy and ordained properly. John accepted the situation without recorded protest and disappears from the sources at that point. Once again, a very quick pope. He was listed in some sources under the designation that will later create confusion. Excuse me. His name was John, you see. He was the 8th person of that name to make some claim to the papacy, and the legitimate Pope John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882, is a different man entirely. Murdered by his own entourage, by the way, but, it is what it is. The two Johns should not be confused, though centuries of copyists have occasionally managed it, and I can't really blame them. The 844 John is notable primarily for the brevity of his tenure and the completeness of the withdrawal. Now, the episode also shows a broader pattern of the dark centuries. Elections conducted by mob acclamation, a procedure that had roots in the early Christian tradition. The voice of the people as a vehicle of divine approval is what I mean. But by this time it had become, at least by the 9th century, primarily an instrument of factional power. Not really a democracy in the good sense, more like a strong-arm mechanism. Well, the Roman aristocratic clans understood that controlling a mob on the day of an election was equivalent to controlling the election itself, and the various entries in this act demonstrate multiple instances of control being exercised. John's mob had acted but miscalculated. Sergius II had clerical support that made his claim practically stronger than the mob's. In the calculation of the period, the question was always which force would prevail on the day, and the forces available to back a claim were rarely reducible to the canonical merits of the person being backed. So, I guess the Roman factions discovered the window between a pope's death and the imperial notification being an opportunity for a fait accompli, and the short-lived John of 844 was one such attempt. The more successful dark century candidates who followed him were others. The degradation of imperial oversight created the space for more of this blurry papacy, and the restoration of effective imperial authority under Otto I after 962 shows what happened when that oversight was restored. And then, of course, Otto III's brutal response to John XVI, but yes, we'll get there. Well, the next one has a significantly more complicated name, Anastasius Bibliothecarius. I know, right? That is the year 855. Now, the case of Anastasius the librarian, which is what Bibliothecarius means, is probably the most intellectually interesting one in this video. Possibly, because he's the only anti-pope to have had a distinguished career inside the church establishment after his deposition. Oh, pretty interesting. Very cool. Cardinal Anastasius had been excommunicated before his anti-pope episode for abandoning his assigned post without permission, a canonical delinquency that made his subsequent elevation particularly irregular. When Leo IV died in 855, a fraction that distrusted the distrusted the elected Benedict III, installed Anastasius in his place. He lasted somewhere between a few days and a few weeks before being removed. The sources are not entirely consistent, but the outcome was Benedict III restored, Anastasius stripped of the dignity he had assumed, and the matter appeared to be done and dusted. There we go, I'm wiping my hands of it. That's what I mean. But here's the thing. It was not closed. At least not completely. Anastasius was subsequently reinstated as a cardinal, and he became the papal librarian. A role in the 9th century meant something much more than just the guy who catalogues the books. He was effectively the head of the papal chancery, and the most influential intellectual figure at the Roman court. He translated the proceedings of the 7th Ecumenical Council from Greek into Latin, making them accessible to the Western Church. He even translated the life of Constantine from Slavonic, preserving crucial evidence about the Cyrillo-Methodian mission to the Slavs. He participated in the great Filioque controversy between Rome and Constantinople, corresponding with Photius of Constantinople in letters of considerable sophistication. in theological terms, of course. Now, he may have also had a hand in the compilation of the false decretals, the 9th century's most consequential forgery. He died in office as librarian sometime after 879. The man, who was an anti-pope for less than a month, spent the next quarter century as the most learned official in the Roman Church. And that's not a bad little side gig, I can tell you that much. Well, Anastasius's rehabilitation is worth understanding. The 9th century was a period when the papacy desperately needed people who could read Greek, the language of the Eastern Church, the language of the great councils, the language in which most of the important theological and canonical decisions of the previous 500 years had been recorded. Anastasius was possibly the only person in Rome who could do this with genuine fluency and scholarly sophistication. It's not enough just to have some conversational Greek. I mean, when we're talking about deep theology, you really need to be quite bookish. His usefulness was simply too great to waste. This is perhaps the most pragmatic moment in the entire anti-pope story. The Church's need for a Greek scholar overrode the institutional embarrassment of rehabilitating the man who occupied the papacy briefly without any authority. Usually they'd just kick you right out the door, but not this guy. They needed him too much. The outcome was that the work Anastasius subsequently produced became part of the permanent Latin Church's intellectual heritage, which means that an anti-pope scholarship is embedded in the foundations of Western Catholic theological learning. And that's, well, it's quite a legacy, I think. Well, next up we have Boniface VII, 974 and 984 to 985. If there's a single entry on this entire list that earns the word villainy without qualification or context, it is Boniface VII, who's sometimes called Franco in the sources because Franco appears to have been his name before he took the pontifical title. In June of 974, within weeks of the election of Benedict VI, Boniface arranged for Benedict's arrest. The circumstances of Benedict's death in Castle Sant'Angelo shortly afterward are not in doubt. He was strangled, probably on Boniface's orders, by a monk named Stephen, who served as the instrument of the act. Boniface seized the papacy, held it for about a month, and was then expelled from Rome by Count Sicco, a supporter of the legitimate succession. But before fleeing, he stripped the treasury, the accumulated donations of centuries, the gold plate of altars, whatever could be moved quickly, and he took it with him, fleeing to Constantinople. He remained there for 10 years. The sources do not record what he did there and how he lived, but it seems that the papal treasury funded quite a comfortable 10 years. In 984, he returned to Rome, in circumstances that are a little unclear, possibly invited by a faction of the Roman nobility. And when he got there, he immediately resumed his claims. The legitimate Pope John XIV, Pietro Canapanova, a former chancellor and imperial secretary, was arrested and imprisoned in Castle Sant'Angelo, the same fortress where Benedict had been strangled to death 10 years earlier, so probably not a good sign. And guess what? John XIV died there within a few months in August of 984. Now, whether he was murdered or starved or died of other causes in imprisonment, we don't know. But the pattern of Boniface's first reign argues against any coincidence. It all seems pretty obvious, right? Well, Boniface then reigned for approximately 11 months. He died in July of 985, and what happened to his body is the most memorable fact about his pontificate. The Roman populace, apparently released from whatever fear they had kept them compliant, retrieved his corpse. They dragged it through the streets of the city, stripped it naked, and they left it in front of the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Hill, which at the time was believed to depict Constantine, and was therefore a specifically imperial monument. Now eventually, a cleric recovered the body and gave it burial, presumably out of respect for the episcopal office rather than any particular feeling toward the man who had held it. The annual Annals of Fulda, compiled at a Frankish monastery some distance from Rome, recorded the assessment of contemporaries with admirable economy. Quote, Boniface, who in no way merited the name of bishop. End quote. He is arguably the worst man in this account, and the competition for that position is not trivial. There is a specific institutional dynamic in Boniface's career that's worth naming too, because it appears in milder forms elsewhere on the list, and that is the phenomenon of the papacy as a prize valuable enough to murder for, in a city where institutional mechanisms for preventing killing were too weak to do so. The treasury of the Roman Church was one of the richest, and it was very movable too. Lots of little things can go missing, accumulated over centuries of donations, bequests, and taxation of an institution with revenues from properties across Christendom. Controlling the papacy meant controlling that wealth. Boniface's flight to Constantinople with the treasury was not an irrational act in purely economic terms. Think about it. He was converting an institutional asset into personal liquid capital before his political position collapsed. I suppose in a weird way it was smart. That asset had been generated by the faith of millions of believers, and that the institution he was looting was the Church of Christ in the city of Peter was the kind of consideration that Boniface VII does not appear to have been finding in any way inhibiting his behavior. And next we have, reigning from 997 to 998, John XVI, or Johannes Philogothos, a Greek from Calabria who'd risen in the hierarchy by ability and connection. He served as a tutor to the young Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, as an abbot of an important monastery, as Archbishop of Piacenza, and as a papal legate sent to Constantinople to negotiate a Greek bride for Otto. He was a trusted figure in both the imperial and ecclesiastical establishments. When the Roman nobility, backed by the Byzantine Empress Mother Theophano, and her faction decided to act against the German Pope Gregory V, the emperor's cousin, by the way, installed by the emperor, despite Roman objections, Philogothos was the candidate they chose, and he accepted. In 997, Gregory was driven from Rome, and Philogothos was installed as John XVI. When Otto III returned to Italy with an army and restored Gregory V, Philogothos was captured. What followed is described in the sources, with the kind of detail that suggests the writers found it simultaneously horrifying and exemplary. He was blinded, his nose was cut off, his lips were cut off, then his tongue was also cut off, or at least cut short. His ears were cut off too, and mutilated in this manner he was dressed in what remained of his episcopal vestments, and mounted backwards on a donkey. The specific inversion of the episcopal rite was the point, the visible literalization of his degraded and reversed status, and then they paraded him through Rome. He was brought before a synod presided over by Gregory V himself, where the remaining symbolic elements of his episcopal dignity were formally stripped away. He was then imprisoned in a monastery in the mountains. He lived for some years after this, apparently in wretched condition. No wonder. Otto III, according to some accounts, expressed discomfort at the spectacle, but did not prevent it. Gregory V died in the following year, possibly of malaria, possibly by other means. Rome in this period was dangerous for popes, regardless of which category they occupied. But, this was pretty bad. It usually wasn't that dangerous, good lord. Anyway, the punishment inflicted on John was not unique to the specific case of an anti-pope. This catalogue of mutilations, the blinding the nose, lips, tongue, and ears, was recognizable in Byzantium penal vocabulary, drawn from the system of governance that produced such punishments for treason and usurpation as a matter of imperial policy. And the backwards donkey procession, that was Roman in its theatrical humiliation. What the combination produced was a spectacle that functioned as a public statement about the nature of sacred authority. This man had claimed the highest office of the church, and his body was being marked with the inscription of that claim's falseness in every way. Whatever sympathy that Otto III had reportedly felt for Philogothos, he did not allow it to interfere with the symbolic program of his degradation. Right, so before we move on to the next round of anti-popes, a little bit of an intermission. We need to talk about a bit of the reforms because things were changing. I mean, they eventually had to, right? Well, the 11th century saw the Catholic Church attempt something that they'd never really attempted before. And that was a program of self-reform aimed at eliminating simony, which is the purchase of church offices, also clerical marriage and concubinage, and most crucially, lay investiture. Excuse me. Well, that basically means the appointment of bishops and abbots by secular rulers who then expected loyalty and political service in return. Sounds quite a lot like modern politics. Perhaps there needs to be some more reforms there. Now, the reform movement centered on the Cluniac monastic tradition and driven into the papacy by figures like Pope Leo IX, and ultimately by Hildebrand, who became Gregory VII, produced an institutional conflict within the Holy Roman Empire of such an intensity that it reshaped politics for 2 centuries. And it also, in a bit of a paradox, institutionalized and industrialized the production of anti-popes. When emperors needed institutional leverage against reform popes, they needed alternative popes rather than just alternative violence. The mechanism changed. Now, it was not Roman mobs and aristocratic families producing anti-popes, but the most powerful monarchy in Europe, requiring rival bishops of Rome as instruments of political warfare. The Reform papacy's paradox was precise. The harder it worked to establish the criteria for a legitimate election, the more clearly it defined what an illegitimate one looked like, and therefore the more clearly it provided the template for a rival claimant who met those criteria, or the supporters who claimed he did at least. The 1059 decree, giving cardinals primary electoral authority, was the Reform movement's greatest institutional achievement, and the direct cause of both the Benedict X dispute, eventually the Wibertine Schism as well. Now, every improvement in electoral procedure created a new surface for the imperial party to contest, and this is the institutional logic of reform in a system where the definition of legitimacy is itself the object of the dispute. Tightening the rules doesn't really end the argument, it just changes the terms of it. So, let's meet our first anti-pope of this period. And our first anti-pope is Gregory VI, the anti-pope Gregory of 1012, listed in the traditional sequence as Gregory VI, though the numbering is complicated by a later legitimate pope of the same name. He emerged from the Tusculani, the Tusculani's family's grip on the Roman papacy, one of those aristocratic, old, entrenched families that had a bit of power. Now, the Tusculani had controlled the papacy since the late 10th century, placing family members in the office in succession. The legitimate pope, Benedict VIII, had been elected in 1012, with the family's backing, and with the support of the German King Henry II. Gregory was the candidate of a rival faction that briefly seized the Lateran. He was expelled within months, when Henry's support for Benedict proved to be more effective. He appears in the sources as a function of an aristocratic faction rather than a theological position, and his brief tenure as a transition movement, the aristocratic anti-pope giving way to and eventually causing the reform movement anti-pope. The entry works best as a single concentrated demonstration of where the institution stood before Hildebrand came along to reform it. So, the Tusculani papacy, the period from roughly 1012 to 1044, when the Counts of Tusculum effectively owned the entire office of the Bishopric of Rome, is the most concentrated example of the Dark Century dynamic continuing into the 11th century. Benedict VIII and his brother John XIV and his nephew Benedict IX were successfully members of the same family, the office passing between them like a hot potato, or a hereditary title, whatever way you want to phrase it. Now, Benedict IX was eventually sold, resigned, took the papacy back, was sold again, and generates enough canonical complexity to fill an entirely separate account. The reform movement that would produce the investiture controversy and the great anti-popes of the 11th century was, in part, a direct reaction to the Tusculani decade. Men like Peter Damiani and Hildebrand looked at the Tusculani papacy and concluded that reform was not optional. The Gregory VI anti-pope of 1012 is the first symptom of a disease whose cure would be nearly as dramatic as the illness. The specific mechanism of the Tusculani papacy, the Counts of Tusculum placing relatives in the see through a combination of money and intimidation, was possible because the papacy's electoral apparatus in the early 11th century remained informal enough to be captured by a sufficiently well-organized local power. The Reform Party's response to this capture was institutional, to place the electoral function with the cardinals, to require specific procedures, to build in checks that local aristocratic power could not easily come in and override. The 1059 decree that Benedict X's disputed election produced was the direct legislative outcome of the Tusculani decade. So, in this sense, the Gregory of 1012 and his Tusculan family did the reform papacy a service that they did not intend. Their capture of the office made the case for reform so obvious that even its opponents had difficulty defending the status quo. The family effectively pushed the papacy to its limit and, well, once they made those reforms, the show was over, at least for the Tusculan family. Well, next up we have got Benedict X from 1058 to 1059, known before his papal career as Giovanni Mincio, elected the Bishop of Rome by the Roman nobility in April of 1058, a few days after the death of Pope Stephen IX, and took the name Benedict X after that. The problem, you see, was procedural. Stephen IX had specifically asked the cardinals not to conduct an election until Hildebrand, who was in Germany on papal business, could return. The nobility's election ignored the instruction. The reform faction accordingly declared the election invalid and elected Nicholas II at a council at Siena. Nicholas returned to Rome with Tuscan military support, and Benedict was deposed, condemned, and eventually died, probably around 1073 or later, in obscurity, under a kind of house arrest in a minor Roman church. He had maintained the office for about 9 months. Benedict's lasting historical importance is almost entirely inadvertent. His disputed election directly caused the most consequential piece of electoral legislation in the history of the papacy, the decree In Nomine Domini, issued by Nicholas II at the Lateran Council of 1059, which basically gave the cardinal bishops the primary role in electing the pope, with the broader college of cardinals subsequently ratifying the choice, and the clergy of the people in Rome assenting in purely a formal role. Lay rulers retained a limited right of approval that would later be contested and eventually eliminated completely. This decree is the ancestor of the conclave system, the sealed election process that still operates today. The conclave exists because of this one guy's disputed election. So Benedict X is the most structurally consequential antipope in the account, not because of anything he did, but because of what his existence caused the Church to do in response. So, quick entry on him, but pretty important guy. Next up we have Honorius II / Cadalus of Parma, 1061 to 1064, the German Empire's counterpope to Alexander II, elected at an imperial council in Basel in 1061 by bishops and nobles who actually rejected the 1059 decree, giving cardinals primary electoral authority. What's the point of a decree if people are just going to enjoy it? You know how it is. Now, the regent government for the young Henry IV needed a legitimate-looking ecclesiastical instrument, and Cadalus, taking the name Honorius II, was willing to stand in and provide it. He marched on Rome, twice with an armed force, occupying parts of the city in 1062 and again in 1063. He controlled the Castle St. Angelo for a period. He maintained a court and issued documents. He was never expelled from the imperial orbit entirely, and he continued to have German support and to function as a rival bishop until his death in 1072. What Cadalus demonstrated was that an imperial antipope who had military resources and political backing could maintain a claim almost indefinitely, even without controlling Rome itself, simply by the weight of imperial recognition. Alexander II held the Reform faction and most of Italy in the papalist cardinals, but Cadalus held the emperor's patronage and the German Church's cooperation in territories under imperial control. The stalemate pointed directly toward the larger confrontation that was coming. Cadalus never had the resources or the military success to end the standoff by force. He also never had the political isolation that would have forced him to resign, and so he simply died in 1072, still claiming the papal title. Henry IV was by that point ruling in his own right and had developed far more, let's just say, ambitious views about the papacy than his regency government had. So the Cadalus affair established the template for the Wibbertine schism that followed it, an imperial council claiming authority over church elections on grounds when the Reform Party denied chose a candidate. The Reform papacy, claiming authority from its electoral procedure and theological position, rejected the imperial choice. And the result? A divided church. Not by doctrine, just by jurisdiction, by the question of whose authority extended over whom. Still a big problem, of course. Now, the jurisdictional question, whether secular rulers could legitimately participate in the appointment of clergy, and what level and what form they could do so, was the engine of the entire investiture controversy. And Cadalus's decade of competing papacy was its first full expression. The resolution that came after Clement III's longer and more successful schism was the Concordat of Worms, which drew a distinction between the spiritual and secular aspects of episcopal appointment that satisfied neither side, not entirely at least, but they gave both something to work with, and things moved slowly. But the distinction that it drew, the ring and staff as spiritual symbols conferred by the Church, the scepter as a secular symbol conferring feudal obligations, That was a compromise that preserved the structure of imperial governance while acknowledging the Church's spiritual autonomy. And it's all about those compromises, isn't it? And next up we have Clement III, or Wibert of Ravenna, 1080. Now, Wibert of Ravenna is the most successful anti-pope who ever lived, measured by political control, longevity, and the number of legitimate popes that he outlasted. Now, he was not a corrupt man in the vein of Boniface VII. He was a capable administrator and a competent theologian who had served as Chancellor of the Empire and Archbishop of Ravenna before being drawn into the great conflict of the age, the investiture controversy. The contest between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV over the right to appoint bishops is one of the decisive confrontations in European history. Wibert was kind of the hinge. Gregory VII had excommunicated Henry in 1076 for appointing bishops without papal approval. He was not meant to do that. Now Henry, quite desperate, crossed the Alps in the winter of 1076 to 77 and stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa for 3 days to secure absolution. Now Gregory, who was a canonist as well as a reformer, felt bound to absolve a penitent. To refuse would be to claim the papacy held power beyond Christ's own example, so he decided to absolve Henry. The political victory of Canossa was awarded to Henry then, so good job, cold feet notwithstanding. Well, Henry was excommunicated again in 1080 after further conflicts, and this time he convened a council at Brixen that declared Gregory deposed and elected Wibert as Clement III. Now, Wibert was a credible choice. He was learned, experienced, and without the personal corruption that would have undermined his standing. Henry's army took Rome in 1084. Clement III was enthroned in the Lateran by the emperor himself. Gregory VII, besieged in the castle St. Angelo, was rescued by the Norman mercenary leader Robert Guiscard, whose troops sacked Rome so thoroughly in the process of, quote, relief that Gregory could not safely remain. Funny how that works. Well, he died in Salerno in 1085. His last recorded words from the text, were the text from Psalm 45. I have loved justice and hated iniquity. Therefore, I die in exile. Perhaps one of the greatest death speeches of the Middle Ages. Maybe. In any case, Gregory was succeeded by Victor III, and then by Urban II, who preached the First Crusade at Clermont in 1095. You might recognize him. Clement III was still alive. He was still claiming the papacy when the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099. He outlasted 3 legitimate popes, and was, for substantial periods, in physical possession of Rome itself, something very few legitimate popes of this period could claim, so the win goes to him on that one. Either way, he died in 1100, still holding his claim, still with significant imperial support. His longevity is not an accident. He represented the imperial position coherently, administered the territories he controlled with competence, and maintained a functioning alternative papacy for 20 years. The argument that Clement III was the most successful anti-pope in history has more to support it than simple durability, because he had real power, real recognition, and real accomplishments. What he did not have was Hildebrand's moral force or the reform movement's historical momentum. But like they say, you can't have it all. And maybe you can have it all, just not at the same time. Now, the specific moment of Urban II's preaching of the First Crusade at Clermont in 1095, when Clement was still claiming the papacy from Rome, is worth holding in your mind as an image. The legitimate pope was preaching a war that would reshape the history of the Middle East, mobilizing the military energy of Christian Europe toward Jerusalem, speaking to thousands of knights and clergy in a field in France. And the antipope was in Rome, administering the parts of the city and the church that imperial power gave him, issuing documents, appointing officials, and doing all the pope jobs. He had a claim that lasted 15 years, and that's not a bad tenure. Both men believed they were the vicar of Christ. One of them was preaching the crusade, the other was keeping everything running in the Lateran, making sure the lights were on. Now, the scale of the difference between them in historical visibility is the measure of how thoroughly the Reformed papacy's historical momentum overwhelmed the imperial alternative. I mean, everybody's talking about Urban II, but hey, you never really hear of Clement III, so, well, until you watch this video. Hello. Anyway, let's move on. Well, now we're talking about Theodoric, Adalbert, and Sylvester IV. The death of Clement III in 1100 left the Henrician faction, i.e. the emperor's ecclesiastical party, without its principal instrument, and the subsequent three anti-popes represent the progressively diminishing returns of a cause that had lost its founder. Now, Theodoric was elected by the imperialist holdouts almost immediately, and was captured and imprisoned almost as quickly as that. His entire anti-papacy appears to have lasted weeks, and the monastic imprisonment he was given was the standard resolution for a claimant with no army. Adalbert was even more obscure, a name in a list without the supporting narrative that would make him a character. Sylvester IV lasted somewhat longer, from 1105 to 1111, because he was elected when Henry V turned against his father, Henry IV, creating a brief moment of renewed political uncertainty. As Henry V and the papacy moved towards the accommodation that would eventually produce the Concordat of Worms in 1122, Sylvester's support collapsed. He was given a monastery and a pension, and he disappeared from history. Another papal retirement case. Three anti-popes, each smaller than the last, the diminishing echoes of the Wibertine fire. But these three entries also show a principle that appears throughout the anti-pope list. A schism, once established, generates its own institutional momentum because people have invested in it, literally and politically, with their careers, their property, their clerical allegiances and theological positions. Even when the cause that produced a schism has been resolved or abandoned by its primary sponsors, the residual infrastructure of the schism continues to produce claimants, because the people attached to that infrastructure need it to continue for their own survival. Bit of a sunk cost fallacy. Now, the Wibertine cardinals who elected Theodoric, the imperialist clergy who backed Adalbert, and the nobles supporting Sylvester, had all committed themselves to a position that the Concordat of Worms would eventually declare settled. But until that settlement came, they had no reasons to keep the schism alive. That had nothing to do with the merits of the jurisdictional argument. Next up, from 1118 to 1121, we have Gregory VIII, also known as Maurice Bourdin, the most peripatetic figure in this list, a man whose life traced an arc from a Benedictine monastery in France to the Archbishopric of Braga in Portugal, to finally the role of papal legate in Spain, to the dignity of anti-pope in Rome, and then to the sequence of Italian monasteries where he was kept, held in a kind of high-status imprisonment. He was well educated and capable. His appointment as legate was a mark of trust. The specific act that ended his relationship with the papacy was crowning the Emperor Henry V in 1111, an act that Pope Paschal II had explicitly forbidden. and for which Bourdin was excommunicated. When Henry needed an antipope a few years later, Bourdin was available and willing, or at least willing enough. So he was installed as Gregory VIII in 1118. He held a form of office for 3 years, occupying Rome for periods when imperial forces gave him the military umbrella to do so, and retreating when they did not. When Henry V and the papacy finally reached the agreement in the approach to the Concordat of Worms, Bourdin was abandoned with the promptness characteristic of discarded political instruments, dropped like a bag of potatoes. He was captured in 1121 by the forces of Pope Callixtus II in the castle of Sutri. His public punishment followed the established form for deposed antipopes with a theatrical flourish. He was paraded through the streets of Rome on a camel, which was specifically chosen for its absurdest quality. Camels were exotic and contemptible, but vaguely comic at the same time. The anti-horse of a culture that measured dignity by horsemanship. You know, the equestrian class. So he was then imprisoned in a series of monasteries, the last confirmed reference to him being sometime after 1137. He'd also lived long enough to see the investiture controversy officially resolved, a cause for which he had been installed now concluded without any reference to him. The Bourdin case is also a study in the specific vulnerability of papal legates to the political contradictions of their position. A legate operated in the exact intersection of papal and imperial authority that the investiture controversy was about. He represented the Pope's authority in a territory that the emperor also claimed jurisdiction over. When the emperor demanded an act, a coronation, a concession perhaps, that the Pope had forbidden, the legate faced a choice between the spiritual authority represented and the political reality that he was embedded within. Bourdin chose the political reality and paid the price when the reality changed. The camel on which he was paraded through Rome was in one sense an insult, but in another it was a reasonably accurate picture of how an archbishop who had crowned the wrong emperor looked at the people who had backed the other side. Well, next up we have Celestine II, 1124. When Callixtus II died in December of 1124, the election in Lateran went in favor of a cardinal named Theobaldo Bucapecus, who took the name Celestine II, which is a lot easier to pronounce. So thank you very much for that, Celestine. The ceremony of installation was proceeding when armed supporters of the Frangipani family, a powerful Roman clan who had backed a different candidate, burst into the Lateran and disrupted the proceedings with what sources describe as physical violence. The candidate was seized during the ceremony. The red papal mantle was being placed upon him right at that moment, and they charged on in at, it really made a mess of things, I can imagine. He resigned the dignity he had just been given before the ceremony was even complete. A new election produced Honorius II, Frangipani's preferred candidate, who was consecrated without incident and reigned for 6 years. Celestine II is listed as an anti-pope in some accounts and as a very briefly legitimate pope in others. Canonical question turns on whether his resignation before his complete installation meant he ever had any validity. Well, in any case, he went away, which was the outcome that mattered for the other side. A different Celestine II later legitimately held the office from 1143 to 44. Now, the Frangipani intervention at Celestine's election is the most theatrical demonstration of a problem that the 1059 decree had attempted to solve, but not entirely eliminated: the ability of the Roman aristocracy to physically disrupt a conclave. The decree had given cardinals primary electoral authority, but it had not provided cardinals with the physical security during the election. The Frangipani had armed men. The cardinals had, well, canonical arguments. And in terms of a physical altercation, one is usually better than the other. The armed men prevailed in the immediate moment, of course, and the result was that a man who was apparently the legitimately elected pope became an anti-pope, not because his canonical claim was defective, that was not the case at all, it was fine, but because somebody's private army arrived and, well, changed the dynamic. The subsequent development of conclave law, culminating eventually in the practice of locking cardinals in until they produced an answer, was in part a response to this kind of disruption. If the cardinals cannot be reached, the armed men cannot influence them. So the specific choice of the candidate of the Frangipani imposed Honorius II, a Bolognese cardinal trained in canon law, was not a corrupt choice, at least not in the sense of placing an incompetent in the office. Honorius was, well, he was capable and a consequential pope who approved the new Templar order and managed the papacy's relationship with the German Empire and Norman Kingdom of Sicily with considerable skill. The method by which he achieved office was unacceptable, I'm sure everyone would agree, but the papacy had been all right once he was there. By any reasonable assessment, he was an asset to the institution. The Frangipani had gangster methods and occasionally decent taste in popes, which is a combination that appears more than once in this account. Sure you've noticed. The structural lesson was still that elections conducted under armed threat were elections that could not be trusted to produce the best candidate. Only the candidate whose backers had the most men with weapons available on the specific Tuesday afternoon in December. The conclave system in this light is not merely an electoral procedure, but a security arrangement designed to remove the physical variables that had historically determined too many elections. Well, next up we've got Anacletus II, 1130 to 38. Pietro Pierleoni came from the wealthiest family in Rome. His grandfather had been a Jewish financier who converted to Christianity under Pope Leo IX, and the family had used conversion as a springboard for the most spectacular social ascent in the city's history. Within 2 generations, they had bought their way into the Roman nobility, acquired the robe of the Senate, and established their representatives at the College of Cardinals. Bit of a speed run. Pietro himself had been educated in Paris, had lived in Cluny, the great Burgundian monastery, had served as a cardinal legate in France and England, and was personally known to Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman in Europe, in case you didn't know him. He was, by every measure of 12th century ecclesiastical preparation, a good candidate for the papacy. When Honorius II died in February of 1130, the dying pope attempted to arrange the succession by having a small commission of cardinal bishops designate his preferred successor in advance. The commission chose Gregorio Papareschi, who became Innocent II. But the majority of the Sacred College, roughly 2/3 of the cardinals, had not been part of this commission, and, well, they hadn't been consulted about anything. They proceeded to their own election the same afternoon, and they chose Pietro Pierleoni, who became Anacletus II. The canonical question of which election was valid was, and to some extent remains, genuinely contested. The commission's election could be defended as the dying pope's authorized succession. The majority cardinal's election could be defended as the normal exercise of the full college's authority. So both sides really had a claim to things. Anacletus held Rome. Innocent fled to France. where he found a champion who would determine the outcome. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose moral authority was such that kingdoms aligned themselves at his urging. Bernard worked with relentless energy to build recognition for Innocent across France, Germany, England, and the Italian states. His arguments were canonical, political, and personal. And in the personal category, they were viciously anti-Semitic too. Bernard wrote of Anacletus's Jewish ancestry in terms that made his blood the disqualifying fact, claiming that a man of Jewish lineage should not sit on the throne of St. Peter. He called him of Jewish origin repeatedly, and framed the election of Innocent as a matter of Christian dignity against ancestral contamination. His words, not mine. The propaganda was very effective, though. It was also a document of the specific virulence that medieval Christianity could bring to the question of Jewish identity. And it's not possible to discuss the Anacletus schism honestly without noting this. It's kind of a big deal, right? Anacletus held the office and held Rome for 8 years. He was not a disreputable administrator. His documents are competent, and his appointments are unremarkable. He died in January of 1138, having never been driven out, and never having submitted to Innocent's authority. His successor lasted 2 months before Bernard of Clairvaux appeared in Rome and personally talked him into resigning, whatever that means. The historical tradition subsequently wrote Anacletus entirely out of the record. Almost. His papal documents were suppressed, name was erased where possible, and appointments unrecognized. By the standards of the canonical argument, the question of who legitimately held the office in 1130 was never resolved. The answer given by subsequent history is simply that Innocent's line continued, and Anacletus's did not. In this account, and so many others, the winners write the list. It's just the way it is. Now, the specific irony of Bernard of Clairvaux's role in the schism is that he was simultaneously the most effective advocate for Innocent II's legitimacy, and the man whose rhetoric most thoroughly tainted the resolution. Bernard's moral authority in the 12th century was immense, as we've mentioned. When he said Innocent was the legitimate pope, everybody listened. When he said that the other guy should not sit on the throne, he was making an argument that found many receptive ears. The fact that Bernard is himself a canonized saint, venerated on the 20th of August, while making these arguments, is part of the complexity that the hagiographic tradition has always found easier to set aside rather than engage with. Like many other things in papal history, it's complicated. Okay, let's get on to the next one. We have Victor IV, 1138, also known as Gregorio Conti, elected by Anacletus's remaining cardinals within the days of Anacletus's death in February of 1138, taking the name Victor IV. He held the claim for approximately 2 months, so once again pretty short tenure. Bernard of Clairvaux came to Rome, made his arguments, and persuaded him to submit to Innocent II. Now, Victor IV resigned and prostrated himself before Innocent, who received him with sufficient generosity that the former anti-pope lived out his days in the church's good graces, so not all is lost. Remember, anti-popes aren't always, there for malicious reasons. Sometimes they're just shoehorned in, and, well, it's a bit of a misunderstanding. Now, the resignation is the gentlest conclusion to a schism, and it points to something that Bernard understood, because he was a pretty smart fella, that the problem was not Conti himself, who had no deep personal investment in the claim. He seemed to be pretty lukewarm about it, to be honest with you, but the institutional logic of having cardinals who needed a snap resolution straight away, trying to speed run the whole process. And you know what they say about when you try to rush things, you always seem to make quite a mess of it. In any case, once the logic was satisfied, Victor was happy to go. And by the way, there would be a second Victor IV 21 years later, which creates a specific problem for the numbering that later on we will explain. Now, Victor IV's submission to Innocent II in 1138 was managed with considerable care by Bernard of Clairvaux, who understood that the manner of submission was as important as the fact of it. Bernard had worked for years to build Innocent's support across Europe. He had deployed every argument available, canonical, theological, personal, and had eventually persuaded enough of Christendom's rulers that the schism simply had to end. And so Victor's graceful exit, prostrating himself before Innocent and being received with generosity, it was the final scene in a drama that Bernard had largely written and staged himself. The lesson that the Anacletan schism taught the Church was that a contested election could be resolved not by force alone, but by the moral authority of a figure whose standing transcended the institutional dispute. Always got to be the tipping person on the vote, Anyway, Bernard's role in 1130 to 38 is the kind of template of a religious statesman who appears in the margins of subsequent schisms, brokering the exits that political situations can't really produce on their own. Well, next up we've got Octavian, 1159 to 1164, also known as Victor IV. Again. Well, Octaviano of Monticelli was a Roman nobleman and cardinal who had spent years positioning himself as the imperial party's candidate for the papacy. So, when Adrian IV died in September of 1159, the election of St. Peter's proceeded by divided ballot. A majority chose Roland Bandinelli, who became Alexander III, while the imperial minority chose Octaviano. The specific moment of schism was performed in physical terms. The newly elected Roland was having the red papal mantle placed over his shoulders when Octaviano's supporters rushed in and seized it, which is not very polite. There was a struggle over the mantle itself, a piece of cloth that had become the literal embodiment of legitimacy, which was torn in the process, by the way. That's terrible. Anyway, one of Octaviano's supporters then put the mantle on him, but it went on backwards. He was processed through the basilica while the He was processed through the basilica with the mantle inverted, which is what I'm trying to say. Now, Victor IV, as he styled himself, an anti-pope number that had already been used, we just discussed in 1138, was recognized by Frederick Barbarossa in the German Church, but pretty much nobody else of any significance was really taking him seriously. Quite a problem. Now, Alexander III had the support of France, England, the Lombard cities of northern Italy, and most of the non-German European Church. The schism lasted through Victor IV's death in 1164, and through two further imperial anti-popes. Remember, when we say imperial, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire. Alexander III is now remembered as one of the more consequential medieval popes. He imposed the humiliation of public penance on Henry II of England for Thomas Becket's murder, established the Third Lateran Council, which regularized conclave procedure further, and managed a papacy of remarkable institutional productivity, despite spending significant portions of it outside Rome and in a conflict with the empire. Victor IV died in Lucca in 1164, attended by few and recognized by the church of almost no territory that mattered, so yeah, not much of a after-party at the funeral, I'm afraid. The specific moment of the mantle wrestling in St. Peter's as a kind of darkly comical literalism, two men fighting over a piece of cloth, because that piece of cloth was, well, pretty much the papacy summed up in a materialized object. The red mantle was not the papacy in a canonical sense, but it was the most visible sign, and the election's legitimacy would be asserted by whoever was wearing it when the dust finally settled. Octaviano's supporters tore it and put it on him backwards, and the image of a man proclaimed Pope with his vestments inverted the wrong way around, the sign of his office literally reversed. Well, that's an inadvertent emblem of what the imperial anti-papacy always was in relation to the legitimate succession, in the same forms, though pointing the wrong direction, of course. Ah, metaphors. We love a good metaphor, don't we? Well, next up we have Paschal III, 1164 to 68. Guido of Crema, as he was originally called, elevated as Paschal after Victor IV's death. He is the anti-pope who canonized Charlemagne, so he's a kind of important, I suppose. Frederick Barbarossa wanted his great imperial predecessor elevated to sainthood for both theological and political reasons. Charlemagne as saint would validate the Carolingian imperial legacy and associate the current empire with Christian sanctity in a way that papal Rome, by refusing to cooperate, was denying. Paschal III performed the canonization at Aachen in December of 1165. The legitimacy of that canonization, performed by an anti-pope whom the Roman Church did not recognize, has never really been addressed formally. So, there is that. And I don't think anyone really has the guts to really go after Charlemagne's coronation. I mean, come on. Anyway, Charlemagne is still venerated on the 28th of January in the Diocese of Aachen and in some other places. The feast was added to the Roman martyrology without the underlying canonization controversy being revisited. The Church's approach to the question has been one of careful institutional silence. Paschal III died in 1168 without ever really controlling Rome, his papacy an extension of Barbarossa's failing Italian policy, but we're not going to talk too much about that. Now, the canonization of Charlemagne by Paschal is the most lasting, concrete act of any anti-pope in this whole video, I would say, and its canonical status is the most carefully avoided question in the modern Church's engagement with its own history. The Feast of Charlemagne has subsequently been observed up to this day, and nothing's going to change. So, next up we have Callixtus and Innocent III. Sorry, that's Callixtus III and Innocent III, also known as Lando, 1168 to 1180. They are the two final imperial anti-popes of this period, and they are the most obscure entries in this account. Giovanni de Struma became Callixtus III in 1168 and lasted 10 years, until Frederick Barbarossa finally made peace with Alexander III at the Peace of Venice in 1177. Callixtus accepted the peace, submitted to Alexander, and was made Bishop of Benevento as part of the settlement, a comfortable and dignified resolution after 9 years of anti-papacy. Lando Citino, who styled himself Innocent III, was elected by a tiny remnant faction in 1179 or 1180 that refused to accept Barbarossa's accommodation with Rome. He lasted about a year, held in a monastery toward the end, and it is the most obscure member of the Alexandrine Schism's final phase. The entry is worth including because Lando demonstrates the principle that a schism once established produces its own institutional momentum. There were people who had invested in the imperial anti-papacy, whose interests required its continuation even after the emperor who had created it had made its peace. Now, speaking of the Peace of Venice in 1177, at which Barbarossa submitted to Alexander III, and the two men publicly reconciled in the Basilica of St. Mark, that was one of the greatest ceremonial moments of the medieval church-state drama. Callixtus III's subsequent acceptance of the peace and his career as Bishop of Benevento shows that the resolution was managed with care for those on the losing side. Visible submission was required, but humiliation beyond the symbolic degree was not imposed on those who cooperated. And that's the thing. You have to cooperate. Lando Cetino's refusal to accept the peace and his disappearance into a monastery shows the other possible outcome. Those are the two fates, bishopric versus monastery. They were the incentive structure that the papacy used to manage the schism's end. Now, before we get into the next round of anti-popes, a quick little word on the Western Schism. The Western Schism is basically the period when the anti-pope problem stopped being a local Italian issue and became a crisis of the entire Western Church. The Avignon papacy, where French-born popes had resided since 1309, had produced a church that looked to many observers like a department of the French crown, and you can't really blame them for making that observation. Gregory XI returned to Rome in 1377, and he died there the next year, setting the stage for an election conducted under conditions of mob intimidation that gave anyone clever enough to look for legal ambiguity exactly the material that they needed. What followed was nearly 70 years of split, during which half of Christendom, including its greatest saints, followed one line of popes, while the other half followed another line. The Western Schism produced the largest number of genuinely contested cases in the anti-pope list, cases where the designation of illegitimacy is as much of a verdict of subsequent political history as of, canonical analysis. Anyway, the Western Schism also introduced a new category of anti-pope, the man elected by a majority of the College of Cardinals who subsequently loses the political context. Now, Clement VII and Benedict XIII were both elected by significant portions of the cardinalate. Hang on, sorry, I got a message on my phone. Not sure if you heard that vibration, I'll just ignore that. Now, both of them administered functioning obediences with their own clergy, their own diplomatic corps, their own canonizations and appointments. The question of whether they were anti-popes or legitimate popes, who eventually lost, that is, well, that's once again another one of those questions that the Church is yet to formally give us an answer on. I'm sure you're all waiting with bated breath on that. Well, it is a question that the Church has decided to manage by proceeding from 1417 onward without a verdict on what came before. So keep that in mind, because the Western Schism is also an era where the personal characters of the claimants matter the most, because the combination of legal ambiguity and individual personality produced outcomes that pure institutional analysis don't really cut it when you need to explain things in simple ways. So, the first one we have Nicholas V, 1328 to 1330, also known as Pietro Rainalducci, a Franciscan friar, formerly a lay widower, who had ended religious life after his wife's death, rest in peace to her good soul. He was installed as Nicholas V in May 1328 by Louis IV of Bavaria, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was engaged in prolonged conflict with Pope John XXII over both political and theological questions. Now, John the 22nd had excommunicated Louis. Louis had declared John heretical. Louis then needed a pope who would cooperate with him. So the radical Franciscan fringe, which had its own quarrel with John the 22nd over apostolic poverty, provided the theological scaffolding for this. Louis provided the military support, Rainalducci provided the compliance. His installation in Rome was celebrated with a ceremony that included the customary acclamations, but lacked the support of any significant churchmen outside Louis's immediate orbit. The anti-papacy lasted about 2 years, during which the ground progressively shifted beneath it. Louis's Italian campaign failed to establish the military dominance that would have given Nicholas V real credibility. The Italian cities that had initially supported Louis withdrew their backing. Nicholas was abandoned progressively, till he was left with almost nothing but the title itself. In August of 1330, he surrendered himself to the papal court at Avignon, appearing before John the 22nd with a rope around his neck. Now that's a bold choice of outfit. Have to accessorize the traditional posture of complete submission, the penitent's gesture stripped of all dignity. Yeah, not good. Not a good look. In any case, he dropped down to his knees and started begging absolution. But John the 22nd treated him with relative clemency. He was imprisoned in Avignon, but provided with adequate food and lodging, and he wasn't physically harmed. He died in 1333. He is the warm-up act for the real catastrophe, though. The structural conditions for a major schism were in place, but the characters had not yet arrived who could sustain one. The rope around his neck when he appeared at Avignon is not merely a gesture of personal submission. This was the traditional posture of a criminal surrendering to judgment. The fact that John didn't order his immediate hanging, that he was imprisoned in relative comfort rather than executed, well, that shows the Pope's genuine authority in the situation, and a calculation that visibly displayed mercy was going to be a lot more useful. Seems to have paid off. So, Gregory XI's return to Rome in January 1377 ended the Avignon papacy's 68 years of Frenchness. But the move did not stabilize the institution. Bad luck, if you were expecting that. Problem with Gregory is that he was ill, exhausted by the effort of the return, and faced by a Roman city that frankly hated him for having been away for so long and wanted to make sure he stuck around. He died in March of 1378, and the conclave that followed was conducted in conditions of extraordinary pressure. The Roman mob gathered outside the papal palace in the Vatican, and audible throughout the proceedings was demanding an Italian pope, with a clarity that stopped short just of a physical assault. Pew, pew, pew. Now the cardinals, mostly French, and understandably alarmed, elected the Italian Archbishop of Bari, Bartolomeo Prignano, who became Urban VI. Now, Urban VI proved, upon assuming office, to be the man whose behavior the cardinals found completely impossible to work with or tolerate. He would berate them publicly. He accused them of corruption and venality in terms that went beyond the reforming rhetoric into what contemporaries described as threatening and erratic behavior. Certainly not very popely, we could say. So within months the French cardinals had reconvened, safely this time in Anagni, just outside Rome, and declared that their election of Urban had been conducted under duress, that fear that the mob had vitiated their free choice, and therefore the election was annulled. They proceeded to elect Robert of Geneva, or Robert, as they called him, as Clement VII. The legal argument about duress was not frivolous, by the way. There had been genuinely a mob. The cardinals had genuinely been frightened. I mean, there was only really one thing they could do to get themselves out of that situation. But whether the fear had genuinely invalidated their will, that is a different question, one that canon lawyers are still talking about. Christendom split. France, Scotland, Navarre, Castile, and Aragon, they recognized Clement. England, Germany, most of Italy, Scandinavia, and Portugal recognized Urban. The mechanism of the Western Schism was pure legal ambiguity, and it was genuinely unanswerable. No council or decree ever formally settled which line was legitimate. The legal argument made by the rebel cardinals that their election of Urban had been performed under duress, that was not frivolous either, but it did have a logical problem. The canon law of the period did not clearly specify what level of external pressure was sufficient to vitiate an election. Fear was a factor, but cardinals participating in an election in Rome, surrounded by a Roman mob, were in some degree always operating under pressure. So what was the difference this time? Anyway, there is this lack of a clear canonical standard. That's kind of a problem. But the Western Schism was, and we can say this with quite a bit of certainty, a procedural failure. The Church had not built adequate legal infrastructure to handle a contested election, and paid for that failure with 40 years of institutional catastrophe. They say it gets worse before it gets better, but it just seems to be getting worse and worse, right? Clement VII, i.e. Robert of Geneva, 1378 to 1394. Let's talk about him in a bit of detail. He held the office of Cardinal Legate in Italy in 1376 to 77, or rather, and 77, charged with restoring papal authority over the rebellious cities of the Papal States. He had employed the Breton mercenary companies, routiers, whose reputation for brutality was specific and, frankly, earned. Now, when the city of Cesena, near Forli, rose in revolt against the papal administration in February of 1377, Robert arrived and the mercenaries were unleashed. The massacre of Cesena is recorded by multiple contemporary chroniclers, several thousand civilians killed over a few days, the city comprehensively sacked, the survivors scattered. Not very Pope-like behavior, I'm sure you can agree. Now, the phrase attributed to Robert, blood and more blood, appears in Florentine sources, and may be exactly what he said, or maybe what contemporaries believed what he said, which amounts to the same thing in historical terms, I'll be quite honest with you. The Florentines, who had their own reasons to distrust the papacy, called him the Butcher of Cesena, and the name has stuck ever since. This is the man the rebel cardinals elected in September of 1378 as Clement VII. His election was conducted by the same cardinals who had elected Urban VI 5 months earlier, which gave the Avignon line its most powerful legal argument, i.e., if those cardinals' election of Urban had been valid, their subsequent declaration of its annulment and their election of Clement must have also been conducted by men with authority. Robert established his court at Avignon, where the papal palace and administration already existed, and ruled from there for 16 years as the obedience of France and its allies Pope. He was not beyond the Cesena massacre, a notably corrupt man by the standards of the age. His court was conventional. His administration was functional, and his theology was, well, it was all pretty orthodox, really. Nothing out of the ordinary, except the thousands of dead people in Cesena. The moral and institutional damage of the schism was not primarily about the two men's characters. It was about the fracture itself. Every sacrament administered by every priest appointed by either obedience was potentially invalid if the appointing pope was illegitimate. The question was unanswerable in practice and paralyzing in principle. The saints of the period lined up on different sides. Catherine of Siena had urged Gregory XI to return to Rome and remained within Roman obedience. She died in 1380, worn out by the effort of urging reform on an institution that could not absorb her urgency. Vincent Ferrer, the great Dominican preacher, whose missions converted thousands across Spain and France, followed the Avignon obedience without any troubling doubt. Both Catherine and Vincent would be canonized. Both are saints, but they followed different popes. Clement VII died at Avignon in September of 1394, having outlasted Urban VI and leaving his obedience to be elected by a man who would prove to be the Western Schism's most remarkable character. The specific mechanism by which individual kingdoms chose their obedience in 1378 is worth noting, because it shows that the schism was as much a political as a theological event. The Kingdom of France recognized Clement VII because the Avignon papacy had long been regarded as a French institution, because Clement VII, i.e. Robert of Geneva, was himself a member of the French royal family's orbit, and because French ecclesiastical and royal interests were better served by an Avignon pope than by an Italian one. It needs not to be said. It's obvious, but let's just drive that point home. Now, as far as England, they recognized Urban VI partly because England was at war with France, and therefore found the French pope unacceptable. The allegiances followed existing political fault lines rather than theological analysis, which meant that every political realignment in Europe was a potential shift in the schism's geography. The schism was a diplomatic fact, probably more than an ecclesiastical one, and diplomacy was its ultimate resolution. Always is. Well, next up we've got Benedict XIII, 1394 to 1423. We're certainly getting toward the end of the video. Been going for a while, huh? Told you it'd be a long one. Pedro de Luna was a Spanish cardinal from the Aragonese nobility, elderly, learned, and possessed of a will that the subsequent events would demonstrate was essentially indestructible. He had been one of the cardinals present at the election of Urban VI in 1378. He had then joined the rebel faction that declared Urban's election void and chosen Clement VII. He had served Clement loyally for 16 years. His position on the schism was precise and principled. The way to end it was for both claimants to resign at the same time, clearing the field for an undisputed election. He had actively promoted his solution, the via sessionis, as the mechanism of resolution. When Clement died and the Avignon cardinals chose him as Clement's successor in 1394, September, he committed his capitulation oath to pursue the via sessionis. He would pursue it for the next 29 years without ever actually resigning. The paradox at the heart of Pedro de Luna's career is not hypocrisy, but is rather a genuinely terrible theological bind. Excuse me. You see, he believed the via sessionis was correct in principle, but he also believed that he, specifically he, Pedro de Luna, the duly elected successor of Clement VII, and therefore the legitimate line, was the actual pope. A true pope resigning to clear the way for a new election was not the same thing as a pretender withdrawing. It was the legitimate vicar of Christ, abandoning his divinely assigned office. Not meant to do that, and of course he could not do that. Every time the pressure mounted for him to resign, the logic coiled back to the same inescapable conclusion. If he resigned, he was declaring himself illegitimate, which he could not conscientiously do because he was not. The argument was circular, as you could see. It was also, from inside his frame of reference, absolutely airtight. France, his primary supporter, eventually ran out of patience. In 1398, the French clergy withdrew obedience from Benedict, and French troops blockaded the papal palace at Avignon. He was effectively under siege for 5 years, from 1398 to 1403, living in the palace with a skeleton staff, issuing documents that carried the authority of a pope and the practical weight of a man locked in a building. A nice building, but still. And he escaped in 1403, apparently in disguise. The accounts differ on the details, but the image of the Pope of Avignon slipping out through a postern gate in the night is confirmed in its essentials by multiple sources. He was briefly restored to French recognition, but the political situation continued to deteriorate for him. Kingdom by kingdom, as each major European power assessed its interests and found them better served by resolution than by his particular claim. The Council of Pisa of 1409, convened by the cardinals of both obediences, who had grown desperate for a solution, deposed both Benedict XIII and the Roman claimant Gregory XII, and elected a new pope, Alexander V. Benedict refused to recognize the council's authority. Well, in any case, they were now the claimants. The Council of Constance of 1414 and 1418, the largest ecclesiastical assembly of the medieval period, managed the situation with a little bit more success. Gregory resigned in a deal that preserved his canonical dignity. John XXIII, the third claimant and the Pisan-line successor, was deposed. Benedict XIII was declared deposed by the council, but he really didn't care too much. By this point he had retreated to his fortress of Peñascola, a rocky promontory jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of the Valencian region of Spain, connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus that was easily defensible, and in the right light, eerily beautiful, I might add. He had with him 3 cardinals, a small court, and the conviction that he alone remained the legitimate pope. He continued to function, he issued bulls, he appointed officials. He was, at this point, at least 80 years old. At least, the sources are not certain of his birth date. He created new cardinals from among his small entourage, because the Pope has to have cardinals, and the cardinals who abandoned him were no longer his. When envoys came from the King of Aragon, who had been his most consistent support and was now negotiating the Renmin's end, Benedict received them with full ceremonial dignity of the papal court and made his position quite clear, that he was the Pope of the whole Church. He had always been the Pope of the whole Church, and the matter was not up to debate, especially not a matter subject to negotiation by earthly powers. The big man upstairs had spoken, and he was digging his heels in. In any case, he died at Peñascola in 1423, still at his post and still claiming, still issuing documents under the name Benedict XIII. He was at minimum 85 years old, which is a pretty good run for the 15th century, I must say. The 3 cardinals who survived him immediately held a conclave and elected a successor, because that was what cardinals did when a pope died. The show must go on, as they say. So the Western Schism's last act was still being performed on a rock above the Mediterranean Sea. Now, before we move on, the correspondence that Benedict continued to issue from Peñascola in his final years had a quality that the term delusional can't quite sum up, because there is no evidence that he was deluded in the ordinary and clinical sense. He understood that he'd been abandoned. He understood that the Council of Constance had elected a new pope, and he understood that no kingdom in Europe recognized his authority. But he kept issuing documents anyway, because from within his frame of reference, the actions of earthly councils and earthly kingdoms did not determine the apostolic succession, and he was either the legitimate pope or he was not. And if he was, no council was going to tell him otherwise. The Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset once described a certain type of Spaniard as someone who continues to be himself, regardless of what the world around him says or does. Now, Pedro de Luna is the limit case of that type. He was the most fully realized character in this section of our accounts. Interesting, I think. Anyway, let's move on. Alexander V, 1409 to 1410, also known as Pietro Filarge, born in Crete, raised as an orphan by Franciscan friars, educated at Oxford and Paris, eventually cardinal and Archbishop of Milan. Pretty cool origin story, right? He was one of the most genuinely respected theologians in the Western Church at the time of his election by the Council of Pisa in June 1409. The council had proceeded from a straightforward and desperate logic. You see, there were two men claiming to be pope. Neither one of them was willing to resign. The schism had lasted 30 years, and the only way to resolve it was for the cardinals of both obediences to elect a third undisputed pope. Pietro Filarge became Alexander V. The difficulty was that neither of the two men declared deposed, Gregory XII and Benedict XIII, accepted the deposition. Can't really blame them, I suppose. There were now three simultaneous claimants, which is worse than two. So the original problem has just made the whole thing worse, I suppose. Well, Alexander V was dominated almost immediately by the powerful Cardinal Baldassare Cosa, who managed the military and political operations of the Pisan obedience with a competence and ruthlessness that Alexander seems to be content to leave him. Well, Alexander V died in May of 1410, which solved that problem, less than a year after his election, in Bologna, where Cosa was in residence. Now, this death was extremely convenient for Cosa, who was elected Alexander's successor within weeks. Contemporary sources and some modern historians suggest that Cosa may have had Alexander poisoned. The evidence is circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence is, well, circumstantial. Anyway, let's go move on from that. Well, Alexander V was not a schismatic figure in his personal conduct. He was pretty legitimate in terms of his theology, and he found himself the instrument of a solution that did not work, and he found himself as a subordinate of people who didn't really need him. He left almost no individual mark on the office he held briefly, but still, it's a rather interesting story what happened around this trinity of possible popes. The Council of Pisa's logic was perfectly coherent, but completely ineffective. The cardinals who convened it had the authority, by their own reasoning, to act. They were cardinals of both obediences, They represented the whole church, and the crisis required action that the two sitting claimants were incapable of providing, because neither one of them would resign. But the flaw was that the two sitting claimants did not accept the council's authority to depose them, and had sufficient support in their respective territories to maintain their claims regardless of the council's decrees. The result? Not a solution, just another problem. 3 popes instead of 2. The Council of Constance, 5 years later, would succeed where Pisa failed, primarily because it managed the resignations and depositions procedurally in a way that left the losing parties with something they could accept. Gregory XII's dignity was preserved by having him convene the council session at which he resigned, making the resignation his act, rather than the imposition of the council. Next one we have John the 23rd. Baldassare Cosa had served as an officer in the Neapolitan navy before entering the church, and whether the naval service involved what his opponents called piracy, or what he would have called authorized privateering, depends on what account you find more credible, and who you ask. He was not a man of fastidious theological sensitivity. He was rather one of action, who had discovered that the church was a more efficient vehicle for the exercise of power than the Neapolitan fleet. He had purchased his way into the cardinalate, which was not unusual, and had served as a legate of Bologna. With a combination of military effectiveness and personal licentiousness that the sources record with varying degrees of horrified detail. He was elected by the Pisan cardinals in May of 1410, taking a number that had already been used in the legitimate succession, John the 23rd. He was the most militarily powerful of the 3 simultaneous claimants. He controlled northern Italy, he had military allies, and administered the revenues of a significant portion of the church's territories. He convened the Council of Constance in 1414 at Emperor Sigismund's urging, intending, it appears, to use it as a vehicle for deposing the other 2 claimants, while keeping himself safe and sound. He had misread the situation entirely. The council declared itself superior to the Pope in matters of church reform and reunion, and then it turned its attention to him. When it became clear that deposition was the council's intention, Cosa fled Constance in March of 1415, apparently in disguise. Some sources say dressed as a groom, others as a servant, and he attempted to reach safety. Well, they captured him within days. The charges read against him at the council were the most spectacular set of accusations ever assembled against a single holder of the pontifical claim. Edward Gibbon, with his customary restrained appreciation for this kind of material, wrote that, quote, "The most scandalous charges were suppressed. The Vicar of Christ was only accused of piracy, murder, rape, sodomy, and incest." End quote. Only? I mean, what were the other charges then? Maybe he's talking about blasphemy. I don't know. Those seem worse than blasphemy to me, though. Now, the formal charges at the council included simony on a vast scale, the poisoning of Alexander V, sexual offenses described in terms that subsequent historians have found too detailed for quotation, and various murders. Now, some of this was certainly political exaggeration and propaganda. Some of it was, well, almost certainly grounded in fact. He was deposed on relatively restrained grounds of schism, simony, and scandalous living. The most extreme charges were dropped, possibly because proving them would have been embarrassing for the cardinals who had elected and served him. He was imprisoned by the Emperor Sigismund, paying off his debts and negotiating his release over 3 years. He was eventually ransomed, submitted to the now legitimate Pope Martin V, and was made Cardinal Bishop of Tusculum in 1419, dying in Florence later that year. His tomb in the Florentine baptistery, a magnificent monument by Donatello, executed probably between 1421 and 28, is one of the finest pieces of Renaissance funerary sculpture, the quality of the monument bearing no relation to the quality of the occupant. The name was reclaimed 5 centuries later. Angelo Roncalli, elected pope in 1958, announced at his first public appearance that he would be called John the 23rd. And that choice is deliberate. It acknowledged that Baldassare Cosa had used the number and declared that its use was void, reclaiming the sequence as if Cosa had never existed at all. The Church in 1958 quietly erased Cosa from the line of succession by claiming that number. Now the tomb of Baldassare Cosa has sat opposite the entrance to the building for 6 centuries in the Florence baptistery, and it has been seen by everyone who has entered to be baptized, married, or simply just to take selfies for travel. It is a monument of the first quality, by artists of first rate, and you should see it, even though it commemorates a guy who was deposed by a church on charges of piracy, murder, and fornication. But hey, art is art, right? Anyway, let's move on. Alright, so when Benedict XIII died in 1423, his 3 surviving cardinals at Peñíscola did the only thing that 3 cardinals with a dead pope can do: hold a conclave, elect a new one. Guillermo Sanchez Muñoz, a Spanish canon of Teruel, became Clement VIII, that's right, in June of 1423. The King of Aragon was his primary patron, and that patronage sustained him for 6 years. He had almost no international recognition, but recognition had stopped being the relevant metric sometime before anyway. At this point, the Peñíscola papacy was an institution sustained by inertia and Aragonese political calculations rather than any serious claim on Christendom's attention. One of 3 cardinals, Jean Carrière, dissented from Clement's election, and separately elected a Bernard Garnier as yet another Benedict XIV. Bernard Garnier is the most obscure person that we've talked about in this entire act, elected by one man, recognized by essentially no one, and his dates are uncertain. He simply fades from the record at some point before 1430. Clement VIII was eventually persuaded by Alfonso V of Aragon to negotiate his resignation, which he did in 1429. He was given a comfortable appointment as the Bishop of Majorca, and appears to have been genuinely happy with it. Can't complain. Majorca's pretty good. He died in 1446, having outlived the schism he nominally represented by 17 years. The Peñíscola succession ended not with a theological argument or a military defeat. It ended with a diplomatic negotiation, not to mention a bishopric. Well, after 37 years of schism that had convulsed the entire Western Church, involving councils, armies, popes, anti-popes, saints, massacres, and the systematic destruction of the Church's moral authority in the eyes of the reform movement that would eventually produce Protestantism, it ended with a Spanish politician persuading an elderly Spaniard to accept a comfortable retirement. The scale of the cause and the bathos of its conclusion are equally characteristic of institutional history. The Western Schism's theological consequences extended beyond the immediate crisis. The conciliarist movement that produced the councils of Pisa and Constance the position that a general council of the Church has authority superior to the popes in matters of faith, morals, and reform, emerged directly from the inability of either claimant to resolve the schism by papal authority alone. The argument was that if the Pope could not be trusted to provide a solution, the collective authority of the universal Church must be able to do so. This argument was used successfully at Constance and produced the unified papacy of Martin V. It was then explicitly condemned by subsequent popes as inconsistent with proper ecclesiology, the constitutional theory of the Church, that is. Now the Council of Basel, which produced the last anti-pope, Felix V, was in part an attempt to maintain the conciliarist principle against the papal reassertion. The defeat of Basel and the resignation of Felix V in 1449 represented the papacy's successful reassertion of authority over councils. Now, the Peninsular Line's final collapse in 1429 removed the last formal alternative to Martin V's unified papacy, but it did not resolve the underlying question of which line had been legitimate during the schism. The Council, the Council of Constance had elected Martin in 1417 with the intention of providing an unquestionable new beginning, rather than declaring a verdict on the contested history. Martin himself never issued a formal statement about which of the previous lines had been the legitimate ones. His successors maintained the same judicious silence. The practical consequence is that the Catholic Church, whose institutional identity depends on unbroken successions of legitimate popes, cannot formally declare which man was the real pope in, let's say like 1380. It has simply decided to proceed from 1417 onward on the basis of Martin's election, and to treat everything before it as a regrettable complexity. Well, this is administratively wise, and historically it's honest, in the sense that it acknowledges the question's difficulty. It is institutionally necessary because any other approach would require re-examining the validity of every act, appointment, sacrament under the, quote, wrong obedience for 40 years, and no one wants to do that amount of paperwork. And last up, we've got Felix V, from 1439 to 1449. He was first known as Amadeus VIII of Savoy, a widower, former duke, and man who had established a community of lay hermits called the Hermits of St. Maurice after his wife's death, a form of quasi-monastic retirement that was quite fashionable among the wealthy widowers of the period. He was elected by the Council of Basel in November 1439 to serve as its pope against the legitimate Eugenius IV, with whom the council was engaged in a prolonged dispute about the relative authority of popes and general councils. Amadeus was a layman who had never been ordained, a difficulty addressed by rapid ordination, love that, rapid ordination, through all the necessary ranks, a procedure that had created problems in the case of Constantine II in 768, and that was here regarded with quite a bit less concern, I suppose. He took the name Felix V and invested considerable personal wealth in the project of being the Pope. He funded the council's operations and established a court at Lausanne and then at Geneva. The international recognition he received was modest and progressively declining. France, which had been once the guarantor of Avignon's alternative papacy, was not willing to support another schism so soon, not after the resolution of the last one. Germany eventually made its peace with Eugenius's successor, Nicholas V. Felix V's political space contracted year by year until it consisted primarily of its own Savoyard territories, and a few Swiss cantons that found the Council of Basil's conciliarist theology to be a little more congenial. By the late 1440s, it was clear that the cause was lost. So Felix negotiated his own resignation in April of 1449. The terms he obtained were remarkable. He was made cardinal, given the rank of Cardinal Bishop of Sabina, which placed him second in the entire Sacred College after the Dean of Cardinals, ahead of every other cardinal in the Church's hierarchy. He was also permitted to retain his papal vestments and be addressed as Papa informally. He was given the permanent legateship over his native Savoy. He died in 1451 as a cardinal in full standing with the Roman Church. He is the only anti-pope in 1200 years to retire on genuinely good terms, and the specific quality of those terms, Cardinal Bishop of Sabina, second in the college, the honorary papal title retained, suggests that Nicholas V found it useful to demonstrate that resignation could be made comfortable. In any case, the door closed behind Felix V in 1449, and it has not opened since. The Council of Basil's election of Felix V was a last attempt to assert the conciliarist principle that a general council could override a pope, deposit a pope, and elect a pope. And its failure effectively ended conciliarism as a practical program with the Latin Church for several centuries. Eugene IV and his successor Nicholas V managed the Basil crisis by a combination of patient diplomacy, selective accommodation of the council's legitimate reform demands, and the progressive isolation of the council's intransigent core. And so by the time Felix negotiated his resignation, the council itself had lost most of its membership. What remained was a rump of theologians and minor clergy pursuing a constitutional argument that had lost its political teeth. The resignation and Felix's incorporation into the College of Cardinals showed not merely the end of the last anti-pope, but the definitive reassertion of papal authority over conciliar authority, a constitutional settlement that would hold out until the 20th century. And there you have it, every anti-pope explained in about 3 hours. I mean, if you listen to the end of this, you really are quite special. So you should give yourself a pat on the back. I've enjoyed doing this one. I hope you enjoyed listening. And, well, perhaps some more papal history coming up. The Evil Popes series seemed to be quite popular. So perhaps we'll do a little more. Maybe we'll do evil kings, evil barbers, evil plumbers, evil nail technicians. Who knows? Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you very much to those supporting the channel in terms of crowdfunding us, keeping us ad and sponsor free. Links are in the description and pinned comment. And thank you to everyone who liked, commented, subscribed, told their friends. All of that good stuff. I have been your host, and I wish you all the best out there. Good night, and farewell.